Welcome to OnScript's Biblical World, a podcast exploring the history, archaeology, geography, and cultures of the Bible. Visit us at onscript.study/biblical world.
Welcome, OnScript and Biblical World podcast listeners. I want to share the word about this new podcast that we're launching called The Biblical World, which explores the history, archaeology, geography, and cultures of the Bible. We've been working really hard on this over the last few months and are excited to bring this to you. Our team of co-hosts includes Chris McKinny, Mary Buck, Kyle Keimer, Oliver Hersey, Lynn Koek, and Mark Jansen. You'll get to know them in the next few episodes. We're going to cross-list a few episodes in our regular OnScript feed, but definitely encourage you to go subscribe to The Biblical World wherever you listen to podcasts and give it a rating so more people can hear about this. Also, if you'd like to donate to what we're doing with this new podcast, you can go to onscript.study/donate. And you can find out more about this podcast at onscript.study/biblical world. Special thanks to Ed Hackey for producing this show, to Alan Files for all the hard work he's put in behind the scenes in getting the website up and running, and also to Keith Willis for picking out the theme music. Enjoy this first episode between Chris McKinney and Oliver Hersey on the cultural backgrounds of Hezekiah's cult reform. Thanks so much for listening.
Hi there, fellow Bible scholars. It's good to have you with us today. You're listening to OnScript, the new Biblical World podcast. And today I get to be your host. My name is Oliver Hersey. I'm the president of Jerusalem University College. And I have the honor of being joined by one of my fellow co-hosts of this show, the one and only Dr. Chris McKinney, research fellow for Gesher Media and host of this podcast. I am thrilled about this podcast, Chris, as I think about some of the awesome hosts and guests that we have involved in it. We have a great team of people that you're going to be hearing from who are just gifted teachers, researchers, scholars with high acumen, and also great abilities to listen and ask questions. So I'm just thrilled for our listeners to have the opportunity to get a lot out of this podcast. This podcast is going to be committed to providing opportunity to you, our listeners, to join us in seeing and experiencing and engaging how archaeology and texts can relate and inform each other, and how there's opportunity for us to see and understand the biblical backgrounds, which in turn help us understand Scripture better. So, Chris, are you as excited as I am about this podcast?
I am. I'm really stoked about the podcast, and what is so exciting about the podcast is really what I think is so exciting about this field of inquiry, this field of academics, where you have so much that is happening all the time. That is new. I mean, this is actually one of the main reasons when I was a young student, why, as I thought about being a biblical scholar and involved in biblical studies, what field to follow. And biblical archaeology just really had such an appeal, because not only are the things really interesting and exciting, it's all new all the time. You get new stuff every year, every summer with excavations, and I would say that excitement and really the sensational finds that are often found in really surprising ways, often in ways that we don't really think about, is just making the study of biblical archaeology really fun, and of course the connection with the Bible and how we're to understand the biblical world. And so I'm really excited to see where this podcast is going to take us. We've already had a number of episodes are recorded, and I can already say that many of them are quite fun, with just some exceptional scholars, not only among our hosts, but also with our guests. So I'm really excited, Oliver, to continue this discussion. And we're actually going to look at a similar topic related to that in recent years has really emerged as an important element, and that is the cultic reforms of Hezekiah, king of Judah. Cultic reforms. And I would say that the first thing we have to do when we talk about the word cult is we need to be able to distinguish between the occult and cult. When archaeologists historians, people who are interested in the history of religion, when they talk about cult, they don't mean necessarily a sect or a small offshoot of a particular form of religion, Christianity or Judaism and so on. What they mean is religious. And so in academicese, cult means religious. And so when I say cultic activity, what I'm talking about is religious activity that Hezekiah, king of Judah, reformed in the late 8th century BC. Now, Hezekiah himself was king of Judah in something, he became king in something like 727, 728 BC, and he lasted on the throne up into the mid-680s BC. Now, we actually have an enormous amount of information about Hezekiah, king of Judah, from the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. We have his reign and things happening in his reign mentioned in the books of Kings, in the books of Second Chronicles. We have it also in Isaiah. And not only do we have these sources which really deal quite extensively with his reign. Some kings end up getting just a few lines in the book of Kings. Hezekiah gets 3 whole chapters.
He gets a lot. It's not good when you only get a couple lines.
It's not good. Although sometimes those guys are really important. Like, for instance, Jeroboam II. He gets like 3 lines, and apparently he was the strongest northern king ever to have reigned, which might tell you a little bit about who wrote the Book of Kings.
And what they thought about our friend Jeroboam II.
That's right. That's right. So in general, the Book of Kings is really fun, and in Hezekiah is not a side character to the Book of Kings, because not only the number of chapters, but because of the theology and the scope of discussion really puts Hezekiah on par with 2 other main figures in the Book of Kings. And that would be Solomon, who dominates the first half of the book of 1 Kings, gets 11 whole chapters devoted to him. And I would say also to some extent Josiah, who is a generation or 2 after Hezekiah, where he gets another 3 chapters or so. And these are going to be the 3 main figures of the book. And what Hezekiah experiences is a major, really dangerous situation that threatens the very existence of Judah in the late 8th century. Now, before we get into that too much, let's actually just read what the text says. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, although it would be worthwhile to go back and read 2 Kings chapter 18, but just to set the stage a little bit.
Yeah, let's do that. I like it.
In the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah, and he did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, according to all that David his father had done. He removed the high places and broke the pillars and cut down the Asherah, and he broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days the people of Israel had made offerings to it. It was called Nehushtan. Now that verse 4 is what we're going to focus our attention on. But let's read just a few more verses to get the background from the Bible, but also the background from the Assyrian sources, which are going to play a major role here. He trusted in Yahweh, this is verse 5, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. For he held fast to Yahweh. He did not depart from following him, but kept the commandments that Yahweh commanded Moses. And Yahweh was with him. Wherever he went out, he prospered. He rebelled against the king of Assyria, which we're going to learn later is none other than Sennacherib, and would not...
It's not good. That's not good.
No. He's a pretty powerful dude, and would not serve him. He struck down the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory, from watchtower to fortified city. Now, about the context, we can't spend a ton of time here, but about the context, the context is that in the second half, really the last third of the 8th century BC, something like if you were to divide it up into 3 sets of 33 years, and it fits nice because Tiglath-Pileser III, or as I like to call him, TP3, he invaded in the area of Israel and the Philistine coast and Damascus in about 733 BC. And he is going to invade and destroy Damascus. He's going to conquer whole parts of Israel, including Transjordan and in the area of Galilee, and even probably go up against and destroy the site of Gesher in 733 BC. And essentially, he's going to reduce the northern kingdom of Israel to more or less a rump state, a state that is almost devoid of its main pieces that are significant for it to thrive. The area of Transjordan, the area of Galilee, many of those that were sent off to Assyria. And then it's going to cause its king, whose name is Hoshea, to pay a heavy tribute. Now, this is an important point in this overall discussion because the Assyrians essentially had two main punishments for not paying tribute to the Assyrian king. One is that they defeated you to the point where you called uncle and you said, enough is enough, I'm going to give you my tribute. Or if you were not all that significant, or if you rebelled multiple times, they would often exile you and put a governor on the throne or on the ruling over the former nation that you formerly had. And so in the case of Israel in 733, they pay their tribute. And for the last 10 years or so, they're going to survive as this rump state, the smaller state who continued to pay their tribute year by year until about the year 725 BC. By this point, Tiglath-Pileser III had died, and his son, Shalmaneser V, had ascended to the throne of Assyria. And with the rebellion with Israel and them stopped paying their taxes or their tribute, Shalmaneser V came to Samaria, and over the course of 3 years, we're told in the previous chapter, in 2 Kings chapter 17, Samaria is under siege. Eventually it will fall, its king will be sent into exile, and if you can read the whole chapter, 2 Kings chapter 17, to show the destruction of the northern kingdom. And this is how the northern kingdom essentially is wiped out. It's destroyed. And so in the previous chapter, we have a long discussion of why that is. It doesn't go into political dynamics. It doesn't talk about what was happening in terms of the Phoenicians and the Arameans and so on. But what it tells us is that the reason why Israel is destroyed is because they had, for many generations, from Jeroboam I, from 931 BC on down to 722, they had the high places of Dan and Bethel and many other high places that were scattered throughout the northern kingdom of Israel. And it's because of this that God allowed the destruction of their kingdom. A couple years later, the successor to the throne and the very famous and powerful King Sargon II would actually have to come back to Samaria probably in 721 or 720. We actually have depictions of this from his famous palace of Dor Sharukin, where you can actually see Sumerians being attacked and killed by Sargon II. Sargon II is active in the area, and it's at this time where Judah, by this point under the reign of Hezekiah, is going to pay its tribute. We have famous inscriptions, many of them debated, but it seems like over the course of this period that Hezekiah, as well as some other states, continued to pay their tribute to the Assyrians. And as we move forward, and Sargon II is going to die tragically, at least from the Assyrian perspective, on the battlefield in 705.
Talk about that for a minute. Why is it tragically from an Assyrian perspective? You can't just leave us hanging on that.
Okay, so there's a very important part of this whole discussion. The Assyrians, when they went on campaigns in the West, they do it for their own glory, for their own might, for their own power, their own prestige. And when they do it, they're actually building and furthering the world of the Assyrian core, which is in northern Mesopotamia, Ashur, Nineveh, Kala, and so on. And by continuing to go westward, they're bringing more and more of those outlying territories into their orbit and making them pacified before them. And so their chief god, Ashur, which is also the name of the city, which is also the name of the empire, is a god of war. And the king, whoever that king is bound by duty, tradition, and religion to continue to campaign. This would include campaigns to Babylon, campaigns to the north, campaigns to the east, and in particular, for us, for interest for us, campaigns to the west. And so by dying in battle, it really left things in a disarray. And of course, from the Assyrians' perspective, to lose this great king, Sargon II, who himself was trying to be like Sargon the Great, even naming himself after him, would have really set things back, to put it mildly. And so his son, Sennacherib, would become king in the year 705 and had to deal with a few things before turning his attention towards the west. Now, in those years, 705, 704 BC, when Sennacherib ascended to the throne, the small states, in fact, at JUC, when I was a student, one of my favorite expressions that I learned there was to refer to the empires as the cats and the nation states as the mice. And so as the saying goes, when the cat's away, the mice will play. And one of the mightiest mice of the kingdom of Judah was Hezekiah. And he began to foment rebellion in the area of southern Israel, bringing together as many as he could, and even going into league with some Philistine states to stop paying tribute to the Assyrian king.
That's a bold move. That is a bold move.
It was a bold move, very much so, and we can say with absolute certainty that at least it's not like it hadn't been tried before. It had been tried. We can look at the Assyrian record for, by this point, hundreds of years, and very few times was it actually successful, or at least definitely not in the 8th century. But this also tells us the fact that there's such a strong Assyrian military presence, and there's such a well-known threat. It tells you just how intense things like tribute were to be placed under. And we could also add in the elements that the Assyrian kings considered themselves to be the rulers of the universe, to be the rulers of the world. And we even see this in the inscription, the famous inscription from Nineveh, which depicts the siege of Lachish, something also referenced in this chapter in 2 Kings 18. Judahite prisoners of Lachish are brought before Sennacherib, and it says above his name, Sennacherib, king of the universe. And so what we have in Isaiah 37 and 38, in 2 Kings 18 and 19, the two earliest versions of this story, is really a standoff ultimately between the two kings of the universe. One is Sennacherib, and the other is not Hezekiah, but is Yahweh. In fact, that's what we find in the next chapter, when essentially Hezekiah has nothing left. He's lying, weeping inside of the house of Yahweh, pouring out his heart because he knows that Jerusalem is just upon the cusp of being wiped out, just like Samaria had, and the line of David, the line of David, which starts all the way back in 2 Samuel 7 with the Davidic covenant, and the line of these royal kings is going to be snuffed out. And it's not Hezekiah is so great that he's able to challenge Sennacherib. That's not what the Bible says. Now, he does survive, and that's kind of a whole other story. But it's really setting the stage for this massive campaign in this event, 701 BC, which even until today we consider to be one of the bedrock historical dates of Old Testament history, as well as one of these key core events in biblical history. Now, that all sets the stage, because what we want to do is not talk about Sennacherib. He does come and he does destroy 46 cities, which is apparently not an exaggeration. Dozens of sites have been found with excavated destruction layers, including places like Lachish, Libnah, and so on. But instead, what we want to do is think about this one verse, and I'll read it again, where it says, he removed the high places and broke the pillars and cut down the Asherah, and he broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. We want to think about those maybe a decade before, maybe just a few years before the campaign in 701. Is there any archaeological evidence that seems to support the idea that there was a kind of cultic reform, a religious reform that Hezekiah did in the kingdom of Judah? We know where we know where it's going. We know destruction is on the horizon, and we know ultimately in the story that Sennacherib is successful from his perspective, and that he gets Hezekiah to pay his tribute. He even has to strip off the bronze pillars, Yachin and Boaz, of Solomon's temple and pay tribute. But he doesn't do so without punishment, according to Kings. Many of his soldiers die when the destroyer goes through the camp, much like what we have in the Egyptian Exodus. We know all that's happening on the horizon, but let's just focus on this question of cult reform. Any comments?
It's been good. You've set the stage for us in terms of what's happening with 2 Kings 18, and now we're going to look at what Hezekiah does. And I love, you said it earlier, and it struck me that this section of Scripture comes on the heels of the quite blatant assessment of the northern kingdom's inability to remain faithful to Yahweh. And it's coming on the heels of what is said in chapter 17. So take it away. I think we want to look now at where this reform is taking place and what this reform is entailing, and give us some insight about it.
Yeah, I think that to do that, it's really important to look back at the previous chapter, 2 Kings 17, to see what covenant infidelity looked like. And that is that you have in the northern kingdom syncretism, that is the worship of Yahweh and other deities. But if we focus specifically on the worship of Yahweh, worshiping Yahweh in a way that he has not allowed you to worship. We could basically say worshiping Yahweh as if he were like Baal. That is, worshiping him in various places, worshiping him in specific ways that were not allowed. And in particular, in light of the centralization, if you want to say, or the establishment, which is perhaps a better term, in Jerusalem as the main house and the only house of Yahweh by Solomon, we have the establishment, as I said, of the high places at Dan and Bethel. But as we also pointed, there are many of these other places scattered all throughout the northern kingdom. And towards the end of 2 Kings chapter 17, there's a really interesting line where it talks about how once the people of Israel were taken out of the northern kingdom and sent into exile, that Yahweh actually sent lions and other wild beasts to go and devour people. And they actually had to, the Assyrians did, just to maintain order, had to send back an old priest of Bethel just to get things back to the way they were, which, remember, the way things were ultimately, according to the Deuteronomistic historian, the writer of the Book of Kings, meant exile, but just to get things back to where you could survive without getting eaten by a lion, was that you had to bring this priest back who at least knew some knowledge of Yahweh. Put another way, I always like to say that the Book of Kings presents 40 different kings, 20 in Israel, 20 in Judah. And every single king of the north gets the same grade, an F. They followed in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin.
And that's Solomon's old foreman that takes off and takes a whole contingent of Israel north, and he sets up these 2 golden calves at Dan and Bethel. And it's not good when you get compared to that guy.
No, but every single one does, and
many of them are worse.
Yeah, and exactly, I say that with Ahab and in the case of Ahaziah, they get an F minus. That they did all things worse than the previous kings. Not good, and amazingly, we haven't found the one at Bethel, although there's various theories. But the one at Dan has been identified, and you can visit it until today, the sacrificial altar, as well as the place where the golden calf was likely set up, and even an inscription, a later inscription, which says, to the God who lives at Dan. This is from the Hellenistic period. So we know a lot about what was happening in the northern kingdom, and that can be compared, at least we know a lot about from the text, that can be compared to what was happening in the south. And even though the south has the temple of Yahweh, and if you go back and you read from 1 Kings 12 to 2 Kings 18, where we are now, you will find various kings who did good and various kings who did bad, all with the caveat, even with the good ones, that they followed in the steps of David, who's the grade for the southern kingdom, except the high places remained, the Bamot. They don't necessarily have to be a place that was high, but a place that you had the worship of either other deities or Yahweh in a wrong form. And it's precisely this that this is the object that Hezekiah seems to reform, at least according to 2 Kings chapter 18. And so with that, we should say one other thing about the archaeology, because that's where we're going to turn now, is when we talk about the archaeology of the kingdom of Judah in the Iron Age. And the Iron Age Iron Age 2 is from about 1000 BC to about 586 BC. The period that is most well represented is the 8th century, the time period that we're talking about, and the 7th century BC. And actually, even more so, the 8th century is very well established because it seems that in this period, Judah reached its apex in civilization. This is reflected in the Bible in such texts as Micah, as well as Isaiah. Of course, Chronicles talks about how Uzziah expanded westward against the Philistines. And this is well established now archaeologically that there are many, many sites in the hill country of Judah and the Shephelah and even the coastal plain that were under the control of the Davidic crown, the house of Judah, the house of David. And so when Hezekiah was king, we talked about, that he was maybe feeling a little too big for his britches to reach out and think he could withstand the Assyrian assault. But to his benefit, as a strategist, it was the best moment in time in terms of their military strength and their military power. And so at this peak of let's say material culture, the best fortifications, the most writing till that point in time. Our only monumental inscription, or one of our only monumental inscriptions in Jerusalem, comes from Hezekiah's tunnel, which is dug at this time. The Salome inscription, the fortifications, of course, of the broad wall, the massive fortifications at Lachish, and really all throughout the kingdom. It's during this period where there have been several examples of formerly cultic sites that were then reformed, at least according to the interpreters. The first of these that was uncovered, actually two of these really went hand in hand, both of them uncovered by Yohanan Aharoni. We always got to give a shout out to Yohanan Aharoni as the grandfather or great grandfather, depending on how you want to talk about it, of historical geography. He's, as you know, a real hero. The teacher of Anson Rainey and who was the one of the main figures of JUC for many years.
For many. What a fantastic set of scholars right there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy too. His book, his book that was published in 1979, it's still on my desk, and I still refer to it on a very regular basis. And even though it's, almost 40, it's a classic text. And but anyway, his excavations at these places revealed two places that had a cultic area. One of these, and I'll focus on Beersheba first, was very interesting because as they exposed Beersheba on a very vast scale, something like half of the site was excavated, and all of what you see when you visit the site today dates to this 8th century. That is, when you visit the site of Beersheba, you're actually walking in the city that was destroyed by Sennacherib.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, that's what's. I mean, it's amazing. You're walking through that, but in that city, as you go through the gate, and as you see the storehouses, as you see the four-room houses lined up against the casemate wall, one of the walls just inside that plaza, as you come into the site, included a set of very nice cut stone that had 3 horns. Now, they didn't ever find the 4th, but they found 3 horns, which, when they assembled it, seemed to be a very large sacrificial altar. And one of the interesting things, I'll mention it unless I forget it, is that along the side, it was really interesting that there was an etching, which appears to be a kind of snake, which we don't know if we can say this with certainty, but it is kind of interesting to think about the Nehushtan, the bronze serpent.
Referenced in that passage.
It's referenced in that passage, which of course goes back to the book of Numbers, where we have Moses in the area of Punon, or today Phanon, which is in the northern Arava, just across the border of Israel with Jordan, where there's lots of copper production, which is where that event happened much earlier. And this passage is saying that, yeah, Moses did this and it was good, but the people went after and worshipped this symbol, this Nehushtan, rather than worshiping in the correct place. And so it's interesting that perhaps the snake that is on the one of the stones of the Beersheba altar might be connected with this in some way. Now, it's hard to say with absolute certainty, but it's an interesting point nevertheless. Now, it seems then that in terms of the sequence, the site that you visit at Beersheba, or I should really, well, I'll come back to this in a minute. The site that you visit dates to the reign of Hezekiah, and also the destruction by Sennacherib. But in the decade before or so, that altar was apparently disassembled and rebuilt into the wall. Now, if you have an altar, an altar, especially a sacrificial altar, isn't just by itself. It has a temple, and it has things like incense altars, focal points of worship that would be connected with this. And as it turns out, we also have the prophet Amos talking about the way of Beersheba, and he talks about it in relation to Bethel and Gilgal, other known cultic sites in the northern kingdom. And so it seems that Beersheba was, in the 8th century, and perhaps earlier than this, a cultic site that was in use, and in let's say, for lack of a better date, let's say like 710 or so, it was reformed by Hezekiah or by his officials, who tore down this altar and rebuilt it into the wall, and using it in what we call secondary use. And if you want to see that today, you can see a replica at the site. But the original is in the Israel Museum, and if you listen to this podcast, you'll know to look close for the snake etching. It'll make you feel good, and you'll think, oh, that's 2 Kings 18:4. I knew that. Now, one other thing. I actually don't think that Tel Sheba is exactly Beersheba. Without getting too far in the weeds here, it's interesting that in the book of Joshua chapter 15, but also in Joshua chapter 19, we read about 2 sites, Beersheba and Sheba. The same name, oath or 7, that's if you go back to the Genesis, the Genesis explanation for how we get the name. But the Arabic name of what we call today Beersheba or Tel Sheba is Tel Sheba, which is exactly the name for Sheba. That is the mound of Sheba. And that's what I would identify it with. And ancient Beersheba, which is the site most often mentioned in the south, in my opinion, is most likely where we have modern Beersheba. And in Arabic, the name is called Bir Es Seba, which is exactly the same name. And despite the fact that Aharoni and other archaeologists didn't expose a massive, nice tell for us to walk around in recent years, particularly with the archaeologist of the Israel Antiquities Authority, they've shown that there is a number of important Iron Age remains in and around a well. In fact, the traditional well of Abraham, which sits right along the Nahal Beersheba in southeastern parts of modern Beersheba. Not too far from IKEA, actually.
You can get your cabinets and your ferns and your well.
Exactly. It's for commerce, and so it's keeping its modern example.
So I want to go back to the reform. We were talking about these reforms, and you had said there is archaeological evidence, or perhaps we can interpret it this way. And you gave us this, you walked us through this Nechashut, the snake, the Nehushtan example. Is there anything else at Beersheba or Tel Sheba, or I know there's some other sites like Arad or Moza or Lachish. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about some of the ways we can see data here.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point, and we should also say that this whole thing was heavily debated at the time. I mean, the arguments in archaeology of today, which you can say names like Ami Mazar, Yossi Garfinkel, and Israel Finkelstein, and others from Tel Aviv, those are old war, old battles that go back to Yigal Yadin and Aharoni. And this is precisely the thing that they were talking about. And so if this was a one-off thing in Tel Sheba, you might say, well, maybe they just decided to build another altar and we just haven't found it yet. But as this was happening, we also had excavations by Aharoni right around this time frame occurring at Tel Arad, which is just across the Beersheba Basin, the Negev of the Bible. And this was a very different site. It is a Judahite fortress, which was in use from something like the late 11th century all the way through the destruction of the kingdom of Judah in 586 BC.
It's got such a rich history.
It's a very rich history, but very much a functional military site. Whereas Beersheba is a kind of a provincial center, or Tel Sheba. I say that it's Beersheba. It's a provincial. It's for trade. Whereas this one, it's mostly a fortress. But within the fortress, they constructed, and there's a bit of a debate as to when it was built. They constructed a small shrine. So at Beersheba, we don't have the shrine, but we have the sacrificial altar, which is very close to the description of other four-horned altars in the Bible. At Arad, we have the entire shrine itself, which comprises something like a fifth or a quarter of the entire footprint of this fortress. It includes a courtyard with a sacrificial altar. It includes an inner kind of sanctuary. If we were using the biblical terminology for the temple of Solomon, we might call it the holy place and the holy of holies, because at the back there's a niche with an offering table, 2 incense altars, and either 1 or perhaps 2 standing stones, in Hebrew, masevot. Now, without getting into yet the possibilities of why there may be 2 incense altars and perhaps 2 standing stones, let's talk a little bit about the stratigraphy. And it's important to remember that the sequence of this is held not by really conservative scholars. This is what Zev Herzog, one of the excavators of the site, when Aharoni had tragically died in his mid-50s, he took over it. This is what he would also hold, that essentially the temple was either built in the 9th or perhaps in the early 8th century, and that before the attack of Sennacherib, the altar and the Holy of Holies were retrofitted, and it no longer was used as a religious site, which would fit, again, with what we read in 2 Kings 18:4, that we have a high place that was in use during the reign of Hezekiah, and over the course of his reign went out of use before a destruction. And this is important.
That's interesting.
Right, very interesting. And remember, archaeologists love destructions because destructions seal things. They seal things.
That and they're fun.
They are fun. They smell like destruction, and there's often very nice goodies inside.
Well, and you're right. I mean, it preserves a moment in time, which allows us such brilliant access and insight into what life was like at that moment in time.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. And digging in destruction, even though you maybe should feel bad for them, there's nothing like it. I mean, it's just a real rush to be able to uncover those things for the first time.
So you're saying that that there's evidence of help our audience see this a little bit. There's evidence of this destruction layer, but prior to the destruction layer, we know that the cultic paraphernalia had gone out of use.
Yes, yeah. So when they excavated it, and we should remember that there is a lot of debate about this, and a lot has changed in terms of the pottery. Like, if you've ever heard of the high versus low chronology, the traditionalists versus the maximalists, if you have Exhibit ABC, Arad and its pottery is in that list of exhibits because it is a well-excavated site. It was done by people who were trying to understand the Bible and the biblical connection, and Arad is mentioned in the Shishak relief. So it has to have, presumably, 10th century remains because Shishak came in 925 BC. And so there's a certain very important absolute kind of dates that relate to the relative dates of the pottery that then can be connected with other places like Beersheba and Lachish and so on. Without going too far into the weeds there, it's a very important site and has therefore had a lot of discussion, but there's more or less a consensus-ish, if you will, on the site, that the cultic building was in use probably as early as the 9th century, perhaps, but definitely in the 8th century, and then based upon what they found, that it was covered up a bit, the cultic paraphernalia, cultic remains, and then the site continued to be used, but in 701 BC, Sennacherib came and destroyed it and left his destruction debris. And then after that, the site was rebuilt on top of that destruction debris, which sealed it.
So do we see this similar? Do we see this elsewhere? I mean, you've given us Tel Sheba, you've given us Arad. I mean, is there other 8th century examples like this that perhaps would fit in this contemporaneous time?
Yeah, for a long time, Arad and Beersheba were by themselves, off in the Negev, and for many people who went on JUC trips and field trips, you did these in one day, so you really got the sense. And so I would say for decades even, this idea was out there and it was debated. Is it Josiah? Is it Hezekiah that did this? And then going back even now in the last few years, there have been two discoveries that have really seemed to confirm this idea of a cultic reform. The first one of those is at a place called Tel Moza, which is a fantastic site, and anyone who's been to Jerusalem has actually been to the site without knowing it. Because when you go to Jerusalem from the Ben Gurion airport, you actually drive right over the top of it. It is just below the city or the neighborhood of Mevaseret Zion, just outside Jerusalem, something like 7 miles to the west of Jerusalem. It's a massive, or very important tell that goes back to the Middle Bronze, Late Bronze, Iron Age, and so on. Recently, they uncovered a very large Neolithic site next to it, which is really going to be a very important thing for archaeologists studying these earlier periods. But the whole point of the excavation was they wanted to straighten what they called the death curve, which was the road descending from Mevaseret Zion and then climbing up to Jerusalem. They wanted, because it had this horrible curve right at the end that always caused these accidents.
The death curve. I don't even know.
Which is a great nickname for maybe a syncretic high place that Hezekiah destroys.
I'm going to the death curve, honey.
I'm going to the death curve. And so when the excavations took place, going back, and this is 20 years ago, they found this nice tell, they found this nice building, and even found a number of prestige items in it. But they essentially left it because they decided we're not going to do anything with the highway. Now, about 10 years ago, they re-investigated it under the direction of Shua Kiselevitz, who is now going back to the site after the highway has been completed. And they found an altar with a favisa, which is a ritual bearing of cultic objects, which included several figurines, a horse and rider figurine, a person figurine, and other bones. And then near that, they found a porch that led into a holy place with benches on it, and on the side, they found auxiliary buildings. Now, if that's not connecting with you, that is precisely the description of what you read about the temple of Yahweh, the house of Yahweh of Solomon in 1 Kings 6 and 1 Kings 7, as has been confirmed by other temples, particularly the temple at Ain Dara in Syria and Tel Ta'anat in southeastern Turkey. So this was really kind of a well-established profile of what an Iron Age temple would look like. And Shua Kiselevich's excavations indicated that the building itself was established in either the late 10th or the early 9th century. And at least according to the more recent excavations, they've actually found an earlier temple, which might date to an even earlier part of the 10th century, which is really interesting. This is ongoing as we speak. They're investigating it this summer. But for our purposes, the significant thing was that just like what we saw at Arad, and just like what we saw at Beersheba, in the last decades of the 8th century, it seems that the site went out of use. It was no longer used as a religious compound, a cultic compound, but instead it was used as just a regular building. The altar was essentially buried. Of course, the objects were buried. And so the interpretation was that this is another example of Hezekiah's reform. Now, without going, it seems like there's always bonus material for these. Without going too much, I have the theory that this particular temple is connected with a building mentioned in the Bible. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, when the Ark of the Covenant is moved from Kiryat Yearim to Jerusalem, there's a hiccup. The hiccup is that they put it on a cart being pulled by oxen, and a guy named Uzzah who's supposed to know what to do as a priest, and not supposed to treat the ark like that as if it were agricultural equipment, because it's taken over a threshing floor, and often on a threshing floor, oxen use a threshing sledge to thresh grain. And so here we have the seat of the Lord of the universe being treated as if it were a tractor, and he puts out his hand, and Yahweh strikes him dead. And they call the place at this threshing floor Peretz Uzzah, where we have the breaking out against Uzzah. And David's afraid. So he takes the ark and he places it in the house, which often can be a term for temple, of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Now, we don't know, it doesn't say where this is. It doesn't say it's in Jerusalem. We know it has to be between Kiryat Yearim and Jerusalem, where the ark is eventually going to end up in the city of David. And so my suggestion with this discovery is, because of its location to between Kiryat Yearim, it's just a couple miles to the east, that it's a nice candidate for the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, where in years afterwards, they would remember the connection with the ark, which also kind of reminds us of what we read in 2 Kings 18:4, where they worship after the Nehushtan. They worship something that was actually good in their past, but they go astray and continue to prioritize it. Now, that's neither here nor there for the main point, but it's a fun topic to kind of think about.
That's really interesting to think about, Chris. I like that idea, and I'm going to give it more thought. I think that's a real interesting perspective, and I look forward to thinking more about it.
Yeah, maybe we'll do another episode on that. But we got one more.
But logistically, it makes sense.
It does. It does. And others have made the suggestion independently. But sometime in print, this is supposed to be coming out at some point. Now, lastly, there's one more. And there's a couple other possibilities, but there's one more that's really fascinating. And to bring this full circle, because actually Yochanan Aharoni was trying to go back to Lachish to start his excavations before he turned south to go to Beersheba and Arad. To bring this full circle, we come back to Lachish. Lachish, which is, besides Jerusalem, the most well-known Iron Age Judahite site, and actually in some ways more well-known because of its clear 8th century deposit. There's been numbers of excavations that have taken place there going back to even the beginning of the 20th century with James Leslie Starkey, Aharoni for a very brief period of time, and the main one is David Ushishkin in the 70s. This is particularly interesting for people that have studied with Gabi Barkai, because he was the number one archaeologist below David Ushishkin, and anyone who's studied with Gabi Barkai has spent 6 or 8 hours on on Lachish, telling you about every single stone there. But one of the things Ushishkin did is he found, he excavated a 4-chambered gate, the main gate that you see at Lachish when you go through it, that dates to the 8th century BC, probably founded already in the days of Uzziah, something like 760 BC, and it was the gate that was destroyed in 701 BC. And he excavated one side of the gate. So if you're entering through the gate, it's the one on the left, through one side. And gates, they have chambers. They can be a 6-chambered gate or a 4-chambered gate or 2-chambered gate. This was a 6-chambered gate. And so they had excavated the chambers and the gate itself from the 8th century. They'd only excavated the left side. And they left the right side for future archaeologists, which we're really glad that they did. And along came the 21st century, and new archaeologists came back to Lachish, particularly Yossi Garfinkel and Michael Hazel, and I think the other scholar's name is Klingbeil. They were looking for what we call Lachish 5, thinking that they could find the earliest fortification of the city of Lachish, which could be 10th or 9th century. And they focused mostly on the northern side of the Tel, but the Antiquities Authority and the Parks Authority wanted to develop the site better for guests. And so they said, well, we have this nice gate, let's expose more of it. And so 2 archaeologists, Igor Kremerman and Sa'ar Ganor, they were tasked with excavating the other half of the gate. And they exposed chamber after chamber after chamber. And of course, I said there's 3. Once they got to the 3rd and final of the chambers, as you enter into the city, they found several interesting things. One, they found that it was covered with the same destruction layer of Sennacherib, which is 701 BC. Beneath this destruction layer, inside of this final chamber, and again, for our audience, this is a small area. We're talking about something like 3 by 4 feet. It's a small space. They found an altar that had its horns sawn off, which, if you're a Texas A&M Aggie fan, is very apt, because that's what Aggies do to Longhorns. But its horns were sawn off, and very interestingly, it also included a toilet that was deposited inside of this chamber. Now, there's been some people who say it's not a toilet, but it's a toilet. We have other ones of these toilets. It's cut from rock. It's got a hole in the middle, a little depression, which it leaves, it's pretty clear that's what it's for. But interestingly, this one was never used. There was no evidence, and you might ask, how do we know that? Well, they carried out residue analysis on this toilet, and other toilets of similar types had previous residue analysis done on them, and it was clear that they had been used. And so this one seems to have been purposefully deposited in this chamber to essentially to remove the religious character of it, to sacralize this, to desacralize this area, which, if you're thinking about your biblical trivia, is rather interesting, not only because it can connect us with 2 Kings 18:4, but also because in the book of Kings, a few chapters before this chapter, we read about a pretty bloody king named Jehu, who, after laying waste, of course, to Ahab's descendants at Jezreel, and unspeakable things to Jezebel and so on, and 70 people with their heads in baskets at Jezreel. It's some bad stuff. But really the bloodiest part of that is in Samaria, because Jehu says, Ahab and his sons they they were worshiping Baal just a little. I'm going to worship Baal a lot. And so he brings anyone who wants to worship Baal in this house of Baal, which we must assume was a kind of large temple, perhaps as big or like the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem, hasn't been found yet in Samaria. And as they do that, they lock the doors and they essentially kill everyone in the building. And then it says afterwards that they turn the house of Baal in Samaria into a toilet. Much like what you have going on in this passage. It's in the it's within 100 years of this, around the same time frame, a little bit more than 100 years before this. But you get the idea of what it might mean to destroy and try to remove this religious activity. And so, to conclude, to summarize, we have 4 examples, and there's a few others that are possibilities, but 4 examples which seem to speak to a consistent pattern of the removal, cult reform of these sites. We have Tel Sheba with an altar, a sacrificial altar that was decommissioned. We have the entire shrine at Arad, which actually is perhaps even referenced in an inscription from Arad, the house of Yahweh. That is right before Sennacherib's campaign. It's decommissioned. We have the shrine, well-built structure, much like the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem, decommissioned right before Sennacherib came. Although at Moza, we don't have a destruction that we can point to that would be 701. Apparently, Moza wasn't destroyed then. And then the fourth one, and perhaps the most fantastic of these, is the recent discovery of the western or the eastern gate of Lachish, and the gate from the 8th century that showed an altar that had its horns sawn off and the depositing of a toilet beneath, that is, earlier than the destruction of Sennacherib, all of which seems to support 2 Kings chapter 18:4, which says that Hezekiah tore down the high places.
Well, and this is so great to have you so helpfully articulate all of this and walk us through these sites and what we find there and how they can illuminate our understanding of the reform of Hezekiah in 2 Kings 18. And it's a great example, and this kind of is a great segue to what you're going to be doing this summer for us at JUC. You're joining staff with us in a sense of teaching a course that will be offered this summer in the Jerusalem University College Summer Institute that'll be online. Your class that you're teaching is what archaeology can and cannot tell us about the Bible. Did I get the title right?
Yes, they did. That's it. Yeah,
it's a good title. It's a mouthful, but it's a good title. And what you've just done here, Chris, is given us such a great walkthrough of how archaeology can help inform some of the ways we read the texts in our Bible and shape the way we can understand them and deepen them even, and maybe even verify to a degree some of the things we encounter. So that course, there'll be 6 sessions offered beginning in mid-May that we really, if you're interested in studying the Bible at a deeper level with Chris, you could actually do that this summer through Jerusalem University College. Just go to juc.edu, or you can Google JUC and online summer education. Chris is going to be teaching one of 3 of our classes, and I'm really excited, Chris, about the class that you'll be teaching. I think it's going to be a really insightful class, and I want to take it. I saw your syllabus, and I think the topics that you're covering, the King's List and Joshua, and exploring things from the Exodus all the way to the exile, I think are going to be really, really interesting to think about. So are you excited to teach this course?
I'm very excited to teach the course. Like we said before, this is fun stuff to think through and talk about. And, in thinking about like the perspective on a lot of these things, it's if we're wrong about one of those or 2 of those, it's really, we don't lose anything. But this is really what archaeology can tell us. It can help flesh out what that text might be indicating. What was a high place? What did it mean to have a high place in the ancient world? And so it's just really an exciting way to people always want to say, to prove the Bible true. It's not really proving the Bible true as much as it is trying to illustrate and recover what the biblical text is actually saying.
And in some cases, Chris, what we read in the Bible can also help inform or at least steer to a degree some of the ways we interpret what we are discovering. Because everything you've just described at these sites requires a level of interpretation, and you said that. And different scholars might veto the interpretation, and that's perfectly fine. In fact, we should sometimes veto interpretations because they're not good. And that's where we have to be careful. But I think you've demonstrated how we can be careful and think through critically what we are discovering and unearthing in the excavation process, and possibly what they mean. One of the key things I think you drew attention to is that these elements were found before that destruction layer. And we know that destruction layer, as you put in the outset here of your presentation, comes to us from Sennacherib, who is after Hezekiah's reform.
Right. One final thing about that is Sennacherib, I mean, it's kind of like a 1776 date for Americans. I mean, it's a date that not only do we have the Bible talking about but he has it in many different inscriptions. In fact, the Sennacherib prism, I think there's something like 3 main editions, which specifically mention Hezekiah, specifically mention Jerusalem, 46 cities, and so on. And so it's really, if we know anything about the kingdom of Judah, we know about the late 8th century. We're not talking about things that we know less about, like, for instance, the area of the Israelite settlement and the conquest, Exodus. This is something that we know a lot about, and it has almost kind of that sense of, like in the Second Temple period, where you can connect Josephus with the destruction layers in Jerusalem, where you have text and archaeology aligning so closely with one another. And that's what I think, to your point, really makes this interpretation all the more interesting, because it's backed up against a really important archaeological and historical foundation.
Yeah. No, it's good, and I'm excited for people to sign up for your class, and I hope they do. If you've stumbled across this podcast and it's still before mid-May of 2021, jump on our website, juc.edu, and find our online summer institute. Register for Dr. McKinney's course. You will not be disappointed. We also have other courses if you wanted to register for ones in addition to Dr. McKinney's. We have Dr. Wave Nunley teaching Jesus the Galilean, and then our current president, Dr. Paul Wright, who will be retiring in July, and has been a staple to the JUC community and a rock for many to rely upon. He will be teaching one of the courses as well, and that's reading Psalms geographically. So I think that'll be real interesting as well. So we hope you'll check our website out. We hope you'll rate our podcast here on Script. If you are finding our podcast on a platform, we hope you will give us a 5, share it with a friend or a colleague. We really hope that you will continue tuning in for more episodes to come. We are On Script, the Biblical World Podcast, and I'm Oliver Hersey signing off. Thanks so much, Dr. Chris McKinney, for joining us.
You've been listening to On Script's Biblical World Podcast. If you enjoy this show, please show your support by giving us a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen. You can support the show by visiting onscript.study/donate. Until next time, keep digging.